Good evening, I'm Edel Howland. Welcome to Red, White and Blue. In April, President Trump sent tomahawks flying to strike an airbase in Syria. This came after intelligence reports stated that President Bashar al-Assad's Air Force conducted a chemical attack on a town held by rebels seeking to overthrow Assad. And more recently, the Trump administration accused the Syrian government of carrying out mass killings of thousands of prisoners. So tonight we ask, if President Trump is turning up the heat on Syria, is he entering a tangle of foreign relations he warned against during his campaign? And what's the state of US foreign relations? This evening, to guide us through this conversation, we are very honoured to welcome former US Ambassador to Syria and Israel and Director of Rice University's Baker Institute of Public Policy, Edward Djerejian, and our hosts, David Jones and Gary Polland.
So quite an authority here. Why don't you establish his bona fides?
All right, Ambassador, just give us a brief biography, the highlights of your career. Because it seems to me, just reviewing it, that you've forgotten about more on foreign policy than most people know.
No,
that is in Washington.
Well, I served 8 United States administrations from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton, and served in most of my assignments were in the Middle East. I started out in Beirut, Lebanon, but then later on in my career I became ambassador to Syria under President Reagan and Bush 41. And then Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East under both Bush 41 and then Bill Clinton when he became president. And then Clinton sent me to Israel as U.S. Ambassador to Israel. Before all that, I was at the White House with President Reagan. I was his special assistant and deputy press spokesman for foreign affairs. So it's been a great career. And then in '94, I retired to come here. My wife and I left Israel and came directly to Houston to establish the Baker Institute at Rice University.
Similar weather.
Yeah.
Well, we've had some recent information about Syria, and it starts out this way. The president of Russia asks that our president meet with his foreign minister, and they do meet, and apparently some communications are made that some people say shouldn't have been made. But there's 2 views. I'll ask you which one do you agree with. Schiff, the head of the committee on the House, says any country that shares intelligence with American officials could decide it can't trust the United States, or worse, that it can't trust the president. Now, Mr. McMaster, who is working for the president, said by revealing the city where the information originated, the president had not given away secrets, as nothing you wouldn't know from open source reporting. What does that mean?
Well, I think what it basically means, and there's been a lot of controversy over this, as you've stated, but fundamentally, as long as sources and methods are not disclosed, that's the holy grail of the intelligence community. But the information that a president of the United States gets from the intelligence community is there for him to use. And I've been in a number of meetings with presidents and foreign officials in which what you can consider to be classified information, the knowledge that a president has, is discussed with foreign officials sometimes on very contentious issues. So I think this controversy, really, if there's any smoke, fire underneath the smoke, is if the president actually revealed sources and methods. But the fact that a president is discussing sensitive information with a foreign official is something that happens all the time.
Well, this is an ally. Russia's an ally of the Assad government.
Right.
Do you believe this is some signal from Mr. Trump that maybe we'll have a different policy in that region, and stay away from the regime change that Obama had said was necessary?
Well, look, we have a lot of real problems with Russia. Crimea, Ukraine, its actions in Syria, its total support for the Assad regime, and these hacking issues that are plaguing the atmosphere in Washington in terms of our elections. So we have a lot of real problems with Russia, but what's really important in my view, let's step back from the inner beltway controversies. It's critical for the United States to have a realistic relationship with Russia. They're players. They're players. Let's not forget, the two major nuclear weapon states in the world are the United States and Russia. So while Russia's diminished now, it's no longer the Soviet Union, we've got to establish a realistic dialogue with them. And we have one thing in common that I think is very clear, and that's the fight against terrorism. Russia is a victim of terrorism. Bombings in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, the Chechens. We have, obviously, ever since 9/11, so strong a realpolitik interest in countering terrorism. So that is an area that I think any United States president, whoever he or she may be, would engage the Russians in. So there, if President Trump was trying to establish some common ground there to see how he could more effectively fight ISIS, that's a legitimate subject for discussion.
Let me ask you this, Ambassador. You had a front row seat, you said, with 8 administrations. You know how the White Houses have operated in the past. Do you have any ideas for President Trump of things they may be able to do to improve the performance of the White House, which at this point still looks like they're on training wheels?
and you're free to take another half hour after the show's over.
Okay. Well, look, we just had an event at the Baker Institute, the author of a book called The Gatekeepers, which is about the critical role of the White House Chief of Staff. And former Secretary of State Baker, who was White House Chief of Staff twice, was being interviewed by the author. And it's really clear that a president needs a strong White House Chief of Staff who I would define as a substantive traffic cop. That the president should empower that Chief of Staff to control access to his office, the flow of information, and the coordination of the message. Because the coordination of message is not only foreign policy, but also domestic policy. And that all comes together with the White House Chief of Staff. And what I would recommend to President Trump is you empower your White House Chief of Staff to do his job, and you will be well served.
So this present Chief of Staff probably won't be around very long. is what I mean.
He's not empowered.
Or does he have to have a
well,
cot?
Dave, you know more than I do.
Well, does he have to have a cot next to Trump so that he's there whenever the tweet storm begins in order to do his job?
Well, the introduction of presidential tweets is obviously totally new in our presidential history.
Yeah.
And I follow President Trump on his tweets because I like to know what the policy is.
Yeah, so does his staff. In the introduction, we talked a lot about Syria, the Afghan war. I mean, these, or whatever they call them, police actions. These situations go on forever. We've now been in Afghanistan longer than World War II.
That's
Am
correct.
I right?
That's correct.
Syria has been a train wreck for what, 6 years, 7 years?
6 years.
8 years, created a massive immigration problem out of the country into Europe, which caused all kinds of problems in Europe. It's destabilizing everywhere, and it's still going on. You would have particular insight, having been in the Middle East for a long time. Is there anything we can do to help straighten out this mess?
I think one thing, during the campaign, Trump said that he's against nation building. I agree with that. Because I think what we've seen in our actions in Iraq in 2003, where we tried, after we overthrew Saddam Hussein, we tried to build that nation into a democracy in the Arab world. In my view, that's a bridge too far for even the United States of America. We remain the preeminent power in the world. Yet that is a bridge too far for even the United States of America, because you cannot nation build without a real buy-in from within, from the society, the people, the culture. And you can't impose a new regime through military action. I think these are important lessons that we should have learned. We should have learned a lot of lessons since 1975 in the Vietnam War. Now, when 9/11 happened and we invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban, who were giving safe haven to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, that to me was a totally just war. But we should have stayed the course in Afghanistan, gotten the job done. We got diverted in 2003 in Iraq. We subcontracted out the policy in Afghanistan to the Pakistanis and to the Saudis and others. And to come to your point, Gary, we're in sort of what seems like an endless war. 15 years in Afghanistan already.
Wow, 15
and the Taliban are now coming back. And we're investing more blood and treasure in Afghanistan. So I think we have to take a very clinical, cold-eyed look at what our national security interests are. I'm not an advocate of withdrawal in the face of threat and danger, but since we've gotten ourselves in these messes, we have to sit back and learn what the lessons are, and then structure a strategy going forward that really responds to what our priorities should be. So I hope that this administration, despite all the controversy around it, and this trip that President Trump is now embarked upon today to the Middle East and to Europe, I hope that they come back and take a strategic look at the region and what our priorities are and where we should be investing.
Well, when you were ambassador, of course, you were the Syrian president, or at the time was the dad of the current occupant, correct? Do you have any clues? Did you see anything about the son at the time, knowing that he would be an heir, perhaps, that he could turn into the war criminal that we know him to be?
That's a good question. When I was there, I dealt extensively with the father, Hafez al-Assad, who really put together that hermetically sealed autocratic state. But he was a strategic thinker. Henry Kissinger identified him as perhaps one of the most strategic Arab leaders. He was Machiavellian, but if he told you yes, it was yes. If he told you no, it was no. And actually, Yitzhak Rabin told me that before I went out to Syria in 1988. I was at a luncheon. Rabin was Minister of Defense of Israel at the time, and Frank Carlucci, Secretary of Defense, said, Djerejian's going to be our next ambassador to Syria. And Rabin looked at me, he was puffing on his cigarette, and he looked at me, he said, you're going to be meeting with the most intelligent ruler perhaps in the Arab world. When he says yes, it's yes. When he says no, it's no. That has been our experience. But then he looked at me and he said, but if you leave a loophole in your position, he'll drive a tank through it. I never forgot that.
And Rabin was right.
And Rabin was right. And my last day in Syria, after 3 years in Syria, I told Hafez al-Assad this story. I said, by the way, do you want to know what Yitzhak Rabin told me about you before I came out here? And he smiled. He said, yes. And I told him the story. And then, he was like a frozen face. And I said, well, do you agree? He said, you can tell Rabin this is the only thing I agree with him on.
Oh, yeah. So we talk about the world. The world seems to be like spinning out of control. But let's talk about an area.
But let me finish on the son, Bashar al-Assad.
Oh yes, that was
Bashar,
the question.
The story was so good.
Basil al-Assad, his eldest son, died in a car accident, and he was groomed as the successor. I had met with Basil al-Assad when I was ambassador to Damascus. Charismatic young figure, totally briefed on the policies. With his death, the father was very ill at that time, and he had to take Bashar al-Assad out of London, who was studying ophthalmology, and groom him for the succession. He didn't have much time. That was one of the explanations for what we're seeing now, because Bashar al-Assad was not ready to govern Syria. And I think he's been a brutally weak dictator. When I say brutally weak, because he fired on his people. He had his troops fire on those peaceful demonstrations in the beginning, and that was the beginning of the civil war in Syria. And I called him once on a TV interview. They were asking me this question, what do you think of him? And I met with him 3 times, Bashar al-Assad. I said, he's an ophthalmologist without vision.
Oh my gosh. Well, they've been accused of horrible things.
Right.
Recently discovered possible crematorias used to burn the bodies of political prisoners. Now, with Russia as our new partner in a way, possibly. Should we expect perhaps an easier settlement of this conflict, given our relationship with Russia, which appears to be sort of close?
Yeah, well, that relationship with Russia is still to be constructed. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. But I think without Russia and Iran, who are two key players in Syria, there's not going to be a settlement because they're the two major players. If you look at who's supporting Bashar al-Assad as a regime, it's Russia, it's Iran, and it's Hezbollah, which Iran and Hezbollah are like this. So any realistic diplomatic effort toward a solution has to involve these countries. And that's why I get back to one of the things we talked about earlier. I think it's really critical for the United States and for Russia to establish a workable relationship, because a lot of the problems that we're talking about, not only in the Middle East but in Europe, cannot be resolved without a realistic relationship between the two. I'm not talking about being friends. I'm just talking geopolitically. We have to establish a structural relationship with Russia and they with us.
And there's another area of the world, of course, that we've been involved in, I think, now over 60 years, and that would be the Korean Peninsula.
Oh my God, yes.
And talk about, our troops have been there for 60 years.
I served in the military in Korea.
Yeah. Well, there you go. And probably when you were there, never thought there'd still be troops there. And today, it looks like things are really spinning out of control. We have another dictator who we have real questions about his stability, and they have nuclear weapons. So, your take from all your years of experience, what would you recommend to President Trump he do about the Hermit Kingdom?
Well, I think they're on the right path. Trump has put together a pretty good national security team. You know, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, when you look at the people, once Flynn left, we put McMaster's in, a really top-notch military man with a strategic thinker. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, he knows, I know Rex, he knows something about foreign policy, having led ExxonMobil, 50 countries. And I know when you're an energy CEO and you have to make major investments, you have to know something about foreign policy in those countries before you. And then Mathis, General Mathis at Defense, those three individuals are a strong national security team. I just hope that Trump listens to them. And I think there are indications that he is beginning to listen to them. Because if you look at the Iranian nuclear deal, during the campaign, he's going to get rid of it. He's not getting rid of it. He's just waived the 6 months, I think.
He wants to see if they'll behave.
He wants to see if they'll behave. So basically on Korea, I think the advice that the president's been given, and I think he's following, is that, look, China is a key player. It is the most important ally of North Korea. North Korea depends on its existence in many ways on China. We've got to get China much more constructively engaged in a solution to this. So that's what they're working on. But at the same time, indicating to Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, that there will be limits to actions that he might be contemplating. And I think when the administration fired those Tomahawk missiles into Syria after the chemical weapons attacks, in Syria, that was a bold but measured step, showing the Syrian regime and the Russians and the Iranians there are limits here. Don't cross them. And so I think that same message has gone to the North Koreans.
I think you left out, and she may not be a major player, but the United Nations ambassador, who has called for stiffening of sanctions against North Korea, also said this. You either support North Korea or you support us after this latest ballistic missile test. So far, South Korea, Japan, and China are not on board for additional sanctions. Do we look like a paper tiger now as far as dealing with North Korea?
I think it's going to take a lot more work to get if you will, a coalition to support our position on North Korea. But if you look at these countries, but China probably has the most to lose if Korea goes asunder. It'll have millions of refugees clamoring to get into China. The regime topples. One of China's geopolitical nightmares is that the regime crumbles and it becomes a South Korea. In
And
other
South
words,
Korea goes to their
so yeah,
border.
South Korea goes north and all of a sudden has a United States ally on its borders on the Korean Peninsula. So China has real vested interests. That's why this meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping was very important. They seem to be getting along, but beyond, I believe a lot in personal diplomacy, especially at the presidential level. It's very meaningful. It's very impactful. We saw it, for example, with Bush 41 and Deng Xiaoping during the Tiananmen Square crisis. I mean, personal diplomacy is critical, but you have to go beyond that. But China has a vested interest. So to answer your question, I think we have enough political arguments on China for China to step up to the plate. Japan is our close ally. South Korea is our close ally. They have vested interests in this. So it may not be that difficult. What Ambassador Haley said at the UN, to bring together a closer coalition against North Korea.
Iran is another area that Gary likes to talk about.
I don't trust them.
It happens to be one of the deals, the treaties, the deals, or whatever.
Not a treaty, never.
No, I know that. That was described as the worst in history of mankind by the president during the campaign. So we understand now that the nuclear deal with Iran is intact.
This week.
The sanctions that were to be part of that deal have just been waived.
Correct.
And so what should we look forward to now if that deal is intact and not going to be renegotiated?
Okay, well, I support the nuclear deal. It's obviously not the best deal in the world, but the reason I support it is because when you look at the alternatives, it's better than the alternatives, and I include military action against Iran as one of the alternatives. We did it. I put my name to a survey that was done a few years back, former national security people, in which basically what are the consequences of military action against Iran. And if Israel took military action, it was the assessment that I think has been verified by our intelligence community that we would postpone the Iranian nuclear program by a couple of years. If the United States took military action, 4 years. Now that what we're talking about postponing. We're not talking about eliminating. And no one contemplated the ultimate military action of going in and invading Iran and taking over the country. That's ridiculous. So this deal, we have 10 years under intrusive IAEA inspections, and it has been negotiated. One of the reasons why Trump probably has not walked away from the deal, it's not only the United States, it's the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council and Germany who negotiated this deal.
He may not have known about that.
Well, I'm sure he was.
But is there a red line that Iran could cross?
Yeah, the red line Iran could cross is that if it starts abandoning some of its obligations under the treaty, not the treaty, but under the deal, and the IAEA inspections, which are intrusive, if they start cheating, we'll know.
Yeah, they can go drop the bunker busters on there.
Yeah, if they start cheating, we will know. So now what would be interesting is see what happens after Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, because Iran is very much on the mind of our Arab partners in the Gulf.
That's fascinating, and we're going to learn a lot after that, David.
We had a recent communication from the president to, I believe it was to the former FBI director, that leaks to journalists should be supported by imprisoning them. Do you have any idea about whether or not that's realistic and helpful?
Yeah, we have 30 seconds.
As far as protecting our classified information.
Well, the leaks issues in Washington over Democratic, Republican administrations, this has come up all the time, and every president gets livid when his administration starts leaking. But we have freedom of the press in America. We have the role of the press is critical. You're always going to get leaks for whatever purposes, intense, either political or, just people who want to cause trouble.
So the journalists are safe.
David, Ambassador, time's up, sorry. But leaks are bad. Trump would call them fake news.
Thank
but
you.
not this show.
Thank you, Gary and David. Just remember, if you have a story idea for an episode of Red, White and Blue, please share it. We'd love to hear from you. Submit your comments on Facebook and on Twitter at RWB_8. And for more political analysis, download our podcast, Party Politics, with hosts Jay Eyre and Brandon Rottinghouse at houstonpublicmedia.org/party or anywhere podcasts are available. Thank you and have a great evening.